Throughout its history, the USSR constantly interfered in the internal affairs of other countries. The same applies to the modern Russian Federation today. Back then, however, everything was presented under a sort of noble pretext that many progressive figures fell for from different parts of the world. Unlike Putin's tales about denazification and demetallization, the Soviet propaganda machine operated more clearly, precisely, and professionally, you could say, telling everyone how hard it is for workers and peasants all over the world to live under the heel of the damned capitalists. And that's why it was the sacred duty of the totalitarian Soviet regime to liberate these poor oppressed people from such a terrible yoke and build a state modeled after the Soviet Union, with collective farms, concentration camps, and the only correct views on current events. Today we are starting a series of videos dedicated to how the USSR used not only military, but also outright terrorist methods to achieve its goals. We will analyze why the USSR can confidently be called a hotbed and sponsor of international terrorism. All the more so because many events and decisions from those distant years are still echoing today. We will talk about the most well-known pro-Soviet radical groups that operated during the Cold War years. And we'll start with sunny Italy, where for almost 2 decades the so-called Red Brigades were rampant. Let's look at how Italian militants carried out horrific terrorist acts with Moscow's money. And of course, at the end, we'll answer the question, did SAVOK achieve its main objective? As always, the most objective and clear analysis of those bloody events. My name is Semyon, this is the Mega Show TV channel. Let's begin. Why did the USSR choose the path of terror? First, terrorism has long been part of communist political culture, dating back to the Russian Empire. In Soviet times, many streets, avenues, and squares were named after revolutionary terrorists. Ignacy Grinevetsky, Andrei Zhelyabov, Sofia Perovskaya, Nikolai Kibalchich. Even Lenin's older brother, Alexander Ulyanov, was convicted and executed for planning to assassinate Tsar Alexander III. So there's nothing surprising about the fact that the Soviets followed in the footsteps of their illustrious ancestors. The most important factor that determined the communists' choice of terrorism was the impossibility of achieving their goals by other means, whether legal or military. Thus, terrorism is actually an admission of one's own helplessness. This is exactly what the USSR did after World War II, when it saw that the much-desired revolution was not happening in many Western countries. The workers don't want to overthrow the rule of the damned bourgeoisie. Democracy, private enterprise, and other benefits of a market economy, to collective farms and eternal shortages. Although, according to the ideas of Marxism and Leninism, everything was supposed to be exactly the opposite, it was also impossible to come to power legally. The popularity of communist parties, strangely enough, was constantly declining, as evidenced by election results. But the ambitions of the Kremlin leaders and their desire for world domination did not go away, and so Moscow resorted to terror. Why, Italy specifically? In one of our previous videos, we already touched a bit on the activities of pro-Soviet militants in Western Europe during the Cold War, in the one where we talk about Putin's not-so-brilliant career in the KGB, but I strongly recommend watching that video. You'll learn a lot of interesting things about the early years of the future dictator. So let's continue. At that time, we were talking about the so-called Red Army faction, which is better known by its German abbreviation RAF. It existed in the 1970s and 1980s in West Germany. It was mainly involved in kidnappings and murders of major political figures and businessmen in the name of fighting imperialism and monopoly capitalism. However, due to the strong influence of the United States in West Germany, the RAF did not gain significant traction. Its activities were often suppressed by American intelligence agencies. But Italy was a more tempting and easier target. Therefore, Moscow decided to focus on this country, aiming to bring its puppets to power through violence and intimidation. There were several reasons for choosing Italy. First of all, unlike France or Great Britain, Italy had weak democratic traditions and institutions. For more than 20 years it was led by Hitler's ally, the fascist dictator Benito Mussolini, which left an indelible mark. And even after World War II, many Italians remembered those times with nostalgia and wanted to bring back a strongman regime, and that's not surprising. For example, after the collapse of the USSR, quite a few people also wanted to return to the times of the great and mighty Soviet Union, which many politicians conveniently used to boost their own popularity and come to power. Secondly, the mafia has always played a special role in Italy. Many books have been written about this, and a lot of movies and TV series have been made. And it's always easier to make a deal with the mafia because they're already used to solving problems with weapons. And the third reason is the considerable popularity of the Italian Communist Party. Unlike most European countries, it consistently received between 20 and 30% of the votes in parliamentary elections. This did not allow them to form a government, but it made the communists the main opposition force in Italy, which in a parliamentary republic still had to be taken into account. This also aligned with the interests of the USSR. And although later the communists officially distanced themselves from the atrocities of the Red Brigades and condemned their activities, everyone in Italy understood perfectly well that the Communist Party was actually serving as legal cover for the terrorists. The Red Brigades were involved. And now about the terrorists themselves. The Red Brigades were founded in August 1970 by students Renato Curcio and his wife Margherita Cagol. According to various sources, they were recruited by Soviet intelligence several years earlier. Organizationally, the Red Brigades were overseen by the first directorate of the KGB, more specifically by its Division S. It was responsible for training saboteurs and terrorists to operate in capitalist countries. But in order to conceal its connection with the Red Brigades, the KGB did not act directly, but rather indirectly through its satellite, Czechoslovakia. It was in this country that Italian militants received their training. At the height of their power, there were more than 25,000 of them. Most of the weapons were delivered through Czechoslovakia: explosives, money, and forged documents. Smuggling and heroin trafficking channels were often used to transport weapons. Yes, you heard right. The noble and honest Soviet intelligence officers used international drug traffickers for their own purposes. But really, what else is there to be surprised about? The main goal of the Red Brigades was considered to be the establishment of a revolutionary state and Italy's withdrawal from NATO. In other words, simply put, the collapse of the state from within through terror and further stoking of fear. The establishment of a Soviet-style dictatorship in Italy coming under the influence of the USSR. The Red Brigade's preferred methods were taking hostages and murdering high-ranking officials, politicians, and businessmen, most often by planting explosives in their cars. The militants also carried out armed raids on factories and plants. There they smashed equipment and intimidated workers, forcing them to quit. This was considered a way to undermine the capitalist economy and the stability of society from within. Those who advocated for normal political dialogue with the owners of enterprises were mercilessly killed as traitors to the working class. A vivid example is the murder of the prominent trade union leader Guido Rosa, who, although he sympathized with communist ideas, publicly condemned the violent methods of the Red Brigades. In addition, their victims were often judges, prosecutors, and police officers. In total, the Red Brigades killed at least 400 people. Foreigners also fell victim to their attacks. For example, American Brigadier General James Lee Dozier, who served as Deputy Chief of Staff of NATO's land forces in Europe. He was captured and held hostage for 42 days until he was freed by special forces. A rather rare case for that time, a case of a successful rescue from the clutches of fighters for class justice. The 1970s were the period of greatest activity for the Red Brigades, marked by the kidnapping and murder of Aldo Moro. Explosions and kidnappings became the norm in Italy, just as nowadays missile or drone strikes on Ukrainian cities and villages have become the norm. That's why journalists even call this period the years of lead. But all the previous crimes of the Red Brigades pale in comparison to the murder of Moro, which is considered one of the most notorious terrorist acts not only in Italy's history, but also in the West as a whole. A few words about the victim. In those years, Aldo Moro was the most popular politician in Italy, the leader of the country's largest political force, the Christian Democratic Party. He had already headed the government twice before and had every chance to become prime minister for a third time. On March 16, 1978 in Rome, militants kidnapped Moro after killing all his bodyguards. The terrorists demanded amnesty for 13 of their accomplices who were in prison in exchange for his release. However, this terrorist act had more far-reaching goals. It was a de facto recognition of the Red Brigades by the Italian government as an equal negotiating party. In other words, the kidnappers were seeking to legitimize their power. The kidnapping of such a well-known politician attracted the attention of the world community. People around the world were shocked by such a cynical crime. Pope Paul VI even appealed to the leaders of the militants, asking them to take him hostage instead of Moro. However, after long debates and hesitation, the Italian government itself refused to negotiate with the terrorists. This position was supported by the leaders of all parliamentary parties, including the communists. The then Prime Minister, Giulio Andreotti, in a televised address, formulated the consolidated position of the authorities as follows: negotiations will fatally compromise Italy's political institutions and will be a victory for the terrorists. Aldo Moro was held in captivity for 55 days. And only after realizing the futility of holding the hostage any longer did the leaders of the Red Brigades decide to get rid of him, and at the same time to demonstrate their cruelty and determination. On May 9, 1978 in Rome, the bullet-riddled body of the emaciated politician was found in the trunk of a red Renault parked in the city center. The photo showing the murdered Moro lying in the trunk became world famous and became one of the most well-known symbols of political terror of the 20th century. The end of the Red Terror. Such terrorist activity was bound to prompt action by the authorities. The authorities fought the Red Brigades, though not always successfully. This was also facilitated by the high level of corruption in the Italian police and judicial system. However, gradually and methodically, by the mid-1980s, the security services were cutting off the tentacles of this octopus, whose control center was located in Moscow. CIA agents who were deeply interested in weakening communist influence not only in Italy but throughout Western Europe helped their Italian colleagues with this. In particular, the founder and leader of the Red Brigades, Renato Curcio, was arrested and sentenced to life imprisonment, while his wife, Margherita Kogol, was killed during a shootout with special forces. The organizer of Aldo Moro's kidnapping, Mario Moretti, was also caught in 1981 along with his accomplices and put behind bars for the rest of his life. Hundreds of other militants were arrested or killed. Many terrorists were forced to flee abroad. Some of them are still wanted by Interpol to this day. The successful defeat of the terrorists was also aided by long and meticulous work to plant agents within the Red Brigades themselves. Their activities, with the leadership under arrest, in fact led to the breakup of the unified organization in 1984 into separate groups. It was easier to deal with them, and despite new terrorist attacks, the activity of pro-Soviet forces came to an end. And due to the changed political situation in the USSR, support for the communist terrorists was also brought to an end. Gorbachev, who wanted to make peace with the West, no longer needed a revolution in Italy, and their followers as well. Therefore, in 1988, the remnants of the Red Brigades announced their self-dissolution. Some of yesterday's terrorists announced that they would turn to peaceful means. Overall, it should be concluded that the Soviet government's strategic objectives to turn Italy into another country in the socialist bloc ended in complete failure. Despite the serious damage caused to society, political stability, and the economy, the activities of the Red Brigades and their followers ultimately only led to Italian society coming together in the face of terror. The strengthening of democratic institutions, reforms of the justice system, and the fight against internal corruption played a significant role in the defeat of the militants. Modern Ukraine should also learn this lesson, as pro-Russian forces are lurking on its territory, waiting for their chance. After all, the internal enemy is often more dangerous than the external one. This must always be remembered. Всем пока.